On April 15, 1980, the date Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, passed away, leaving behind a legacy of existential philosophy and a complicated view on human relationships, particularly between men and women. Sartre, known for his work on freedom, responsibility, and the complexity of human existence, often portrayed relationships in ways that seemed to contradict his own calls for liberation. Despite his advocacy for personal freedom and individual agency, his perspective on women was complex, often rooted in traditional gender roles and dependency. Sartre's philosophy revolved around the concept of existential freedom, the idea that humans are condemned to be free, always responsible for their choices. This freedom, he argued, was both empowering and terrifying, as it meant each person was responsible for shaping their life and identity. However, when it came to the roles of men and women, Sartre's ideas seemed to shift. He often viewed relationships between men and women as inherently imbalanced and conflicting, suggesting that true equality might be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in romantic or intimate relationships. In his writings, particularly in Being and Nothingness, Sartre discussed how relationships, especially those involving love or desire, could turn into battles of control. For Sartre, love and desire were fraught with conflict because each person in the relationship tried to dominate or define the other. He believed that in many romantic situations, one partner would inevitably seek control over the other, turning the relationship into a struggle. Sartre famously called this dynamic bad faith, where people deceive themselves or each other, trying to reduce their partner's freedom by making them an object of desire, admiration, or dependency. Sartre viewed this as a common issue in all human relationships, but he often portrayed it as more intense between men and women. For Sartre, women often appeared in his work as figures defined in relation to men, sometimes depicted as dependent on men's desires, or as beings who sought to possess men emotionally. While Sartre was known for his progressive political views, he was a product of his time in many respects, and he sometimes saw women as more passive or dependent. This dependency, he believed, led to a dynamic of conflict. Women, in his view, would try to possess men emotionally, while men would seek to maintain their freedom by keeping women at a distance or turning them into objects of their desire. Sartre's real-life relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, a philosopher and feminist, also reflected this tension. Although they were famously committed to each other, their relationship was unconventional, marked by a mutual agreement to pursue romantic or physical relationships with others. This open relationship was meant to respect their freedom, but in practice, it often exposed underlying issues. Sartre had many relationships with younger women, often students, which de Beauvoir facilitated. These relationships have been criticized as exploitative, suggesting an imbalance of power and an unequal dynamic of dependency. Despite Sartre's insistence on freedom and liberation, his approach to romantic relationships sometimes perpetuated traditional gender roles and dependency. Sartre's philosophy often reduced women to roles that served men's desires. He depicted women as sources of emotional attachment, seen as possessing a form of soft power through their emotional ties, but ultimately portrayed them as dependent on the attention or approval of men. In this view, women were cast as characters who could only find meaning through their relationships with men. Sartre's writings, while complex, rarely showed women as fully independent beings with agency equal to that of men. He saw women as players in a game of power dynamics, in which they sought to capture men emotionally, creating a form of dependency that Sartre seemed to view as limiting. Moreover, Sartre's portrayal of women as other, a concept in existentialism where one person is objectified by another, reinforced this dependency. He suggested that in many relationships, women became the other in a man's life, an object of his desire or affection, but not a true equal partner. This role as other meant that women were defined through the eyes of men, as beings who needed men to give them meaning or purpose. Sartre seemed to believe that while men sought freedom and self-definition, women were often cast into roles that confined them, resulting in a relationship that limited both partners. In many of Sartre's fictional works, such as his plays and novels, female characters often appear in roles that reflect this imbalance. Women are often portrayed as manipulative or seeking control over men, but ultimately limited by their dependence on male validation. For instance, in Sartre's play No Exit, the characters are trapped in a room together, and much of the tension comes from their attempts to define or possess one another. The character Estelle, a woman, seeks affirmation from the male character Garcin, showing a dependency on male validation. This portrayal aligns with Sartre's belief that women, in his view, often tried to control men emotionally, but could not truly liberate themselves from a relationship of dependency. Sartre's ideas about relationships between men and women were paradoxical in many ways. He was a strong advocate for human freedom and personal choice, but his views on women seemed to confine them to roles that served men's desires and depended on men for their identity. This contradiction reflects both the complexity of his ideas and the limitations of his perspective. Sartre's work continues to be studied and respected for its groundbreaking insights into human freedom, but his views on women reveal a bias shaped by traditional notions of gender roles and relationships.